Hello Revolution students, and welcome back to another video on the Chinese Revolution. In this series of videos I'm going to look at China Area of Study 2, and in particular the type of society that the communists and Mao Zedong created once they got into power after 1949. We're going to look at whether the society that the communists created was a communist society as they had hoped. Did they achieve their ideals? Did they create for example, a communist economic system? And if they didn't, what were the challenges that stopped them from achieving this? And the other big question we're going to look at is whether the people benefited or not, which groups did benefit, if they did benefit, which ones didn't within society, within the Chinese society at the time. The time period which we'll be looking at is from 1949, or after October 1949, up to 1971 with the death of Lin Biao. So without much further ado, let's get into it. The first topic we're going to look at, and you can see here, is consolidating the new political system. So how did the communists, once they got into power, and Mao Zedong announced the creation or the establishment of the People's Republic of China at the Gate of Heavenly Peace on the 1st of October 1949. How did they consolidate their power and make sure that they weren't overthrown by counter-revolutionaries? They achieved this in a number of ways. First off, they passed a number of laws which fulfilled the promises that they had made to the Chinese people prior to getting into power. So I'll just open this up now. So these new laws included, and there were two main ones. You can see there, the first one was the marriage law, and that was the first piece of major legislation that they actually passed. And the marriage law, which we're going to look at in a lot more detail in a later video, the marriage law put into law the equality of the sexes. So it enshrined in law that women were equal to men and that they had the same legal rights. It legalised divorce. It stopped some of these oppressive practices that had been in China for centuries, such as foot binding, enforced marriages and so forth. All of that was criminalised, and so that was a big achievement. The second major piece of legislation that they passed was the Agrarian Reform Law, and you can see there it was passed on the 28th of June 1950. That second piece of legislation that fulfilled their promise of land redistribution, the most important promise they made to the Chinese people was that when they got into power, they would redistribute land from the rich and the wealthy landlords to the poor and impoverished peasantry. And then the final piece of, or not the final, but another significant legislative piece of legislation was this 1954 Constitution. Lots of important clauses in there, but perhaps one of the most important I've put up there for you. So all citizens of the People's Republic of China who have reached the age of 18 have the right to vote and stand for election, except insane persons and persons deprived by law of the right to vote and stand for election. This bolded piece here, and this is from Article 86 of the 1954 Constitution, this bolded sentence here, all right, that's really, really important, because it shows that it was that the sort of society that the People's Republic, the sort of society that the communists was making, in their mind it was a democratic society. However, it was not a democracy for everybody, because you could have your rights deprived. So your right to vote, to stand for election, you could be deprived by law of these if, and it doesn't state it here, but if we look back to Mao's work on New Democracy, which he published in 1940, and in that he talks about establishing a democratic society once the communists get into power. However, he's very clear that the rights of the individual would not be given to those who were classed as reactionaries or bad elements. And I think this sentence here in bold is alluding to that. So those people who were labelled either reactionaries or bad elements by the communists, by the government, they were legally able to be deprived of their right to vote and also stand for election. And this is a really important point that you need to keep in mind when we study later events and later mass campaigns and things like this. Not all people in China have rights, and if you get labelled as one of these, if you get labelled as a reactionary or a bad element, then your rights disappear, okay? And we'll see many people were labelled like this, and as a consequence they were sent out to labour camps and they suffered re-education and so forth. But we'll look at that in a lot more detail in the coming videos. Okay, so one way that the communists, one of the key ways that they consolidated their powers was through these new laws. And I just got down the bottom here, and I'll just bring it up. Prior to the passing of the Agrarian Reform Law, Liu Shaoqi made a speech where he set out the situation in China concerning land ownership, and I think it's important in understanding this Agrarian Reform Law. It's also important, we're going to see here, the process of fan shen, or turning over, where the land was, this whole process of land redistribution and how other landlords were persecuted during the process. So here it is here, and it's a speech by Liu Shaoqi on the Agrarian Reform Law. It was given 2 weeks before the introduction of the law in 1950. And this is what he said. The essential content of agrarian reform is the confiscation of the land of the landlord class for distribution to the landless or land poor peasants. Why should such a reform be made? In a nutshell, it is because the original land ownership system in China is extremely irrational. In general, the land situation in old China is roughly as follows. Landlords and rich peasants, who constitute less than 10% of the rural population, possess approximately from 70 to 80% of the land and brutally exploit the peasants by means of their land. Poor peasants, farm labourers, middle peasants and others, however, who make up 90% of the rural population, possess in all only 20 to 30% of the land. So the whole purpose of the Agrarian Reform Law was to balance this, to take some of the land from this, if you can see here, and it's not as because land, take some of the land from 10% of the rich, who own 70 to 80% of the land, and redistribute that to the rest of the people in China. Okay, so that in the situation, in the case of poor peasants, so that they had enough land to actually live on and grow the food they needed for their families to survive. So that's so through new laws, the CCP consolidated their power. They also consolidated their power through mass campaigns, and there were a number of mass campaigns early on in the early years, 1950, 51, 52, 53. You could refer to Fan Shen as, well, it is a mass campaign where the CCP, in conjunction with, in partnership with the peasants themselves, the poor peasants redistributed land from the landlords to the poor peasants. So that was one mass campaign. Other mass campaigns were here. So there was, once they got into power very quickly, the CCP undertook a number of mass campaigns, either to crush their political or class enemies as they saw them, or re-educate all those groups who they just wanted to retain the support of, such as, for example, intellectuals. So the first of these campaigns was a thought reform campaign, and that was targeted at intellectuals to regain their support, or to gain their support for the regime. As a consequence of this thought reform campaign, and we're going to look at this in more detail in a later video, many intellectuals were re-educated or sent to labour camps, those who refused to get rid of or rid themselves of their bourgeois thinking. The next mass campaign was the San Fan, or the Three Antis, and broadly it was to get rid of corruption, or get rid of GMD spies and so forth. The Wu Farm, the five antis, was a big focus on bureaucratic or government corruption, tax evasion and things like this. We're going to look at the Suan Fan and the Wu Fan in more detail in later slides as well. So, and you can see here the purpose broadly of these three campaigns was to crush opposition from class enemies and political opponents such as capitalists and former GMD supporters, and or those who had worked for the GMD. So, apart from the new laws and the mass campaigns, the CCP also consolidated their power by fixing up or stabilising the financial system. When they came into power, the financial system in China was all over the place. There was hyperinflation, government revenues were down and so forth. The CCP came into power because they controlled the economy. They decided to pretty much totally regulate it, set prices, set wages, set the value of currency. All these things stabilise the economy, and we can see them here. So, when the CCP came into power, they introduced a new currency, the renminbi, the people's currency, or the yuan, which is still in circulation today. They nationalised all the banks. They fixed wages and put price controls on basic goods. So they made sure that an average wage could buy enough for a person to both rent a home or buy a home, as well as feed themselves and their family. They also introduced tax reforms and made them more equitable. And these financial reforms had a number of positive consequences for the Chinese economy and its financial system. So, government revenue increased from 6.5 billion yuan in 1950 to 13.3 billion yuan by 1951. So a huge increase in government revenue. And also, and this is probably even a bigger achievement, inflation and hyperinflation, which have been plaguing the GMD government prior to their defeat. The CCP, when they got into power, they fixed it quite quickly. So inflation dropped from 85,000% in 1949 to 15% by 1951, a huge achievement. And they were able to do that because they totally regulated the economy. They controlled the cost of things, the price of things. So, and these sort of things here, these stats, these are the ones that you should be including in your responses in whether you're if you're doing a source analysis, questions, responses, or those extended responses in the first part of the exam, or section A, part 2. If you've got a question about how did the CCP consolidate the new political system. And then finally, the CCP consolidated their power through using the Red Army, which was renamed the People's Liberation Army, or the PLA. And the PLA did a couple of things. So firstly, they enforced communist rule over border areas such as Tibet, Henan and Xinjiang. So Tibet, we all know where that is. Henan is that big island off the southeast coast of China, and Xinjiang, which is in the news a lot these days, is out in the northwest, where at that time there was the majority Uyghur population. So the PLA went out to these areas and regained them for China. PLA officers also helped govern the China's provinces until 1954. So up until 1954, it was pretty much a military regime where PLA officers were acting as civilian governors in many provinces, because the CCP itself just hadn't had the time to set up civilian governors or administrative positions. So up until 1954, the PLA played a very important part. They also played a part in these various mass campaigns and so forth as well. So anyway, so there are the 4 different ways that the CCP consolidated its political authority once it got into power. Some of these I'm going to look at in later videos in a lot more detail, and we'll get to that soon. So anyway, I hope you found this video helpful for your study of China Area of Study 2, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.